Hi everyone, my name is Mike Losecki and I'm your host today. Welcome to the Network's webinar, Instructional Gaming. This webinar is being recorded and we will provide you with instruction on how to access the recording and the slides as soon as they are available. This webinar is brought to you by Maytech Networks. Networks is part of Maytech, a member of the Division of Academic and Student Affairs at the Maricopa Community Colleges here in sunny Arizona today, and funded in part by a grant from the National Science Foundation. Let's get started. We're going to be using the Illuminate interface this morning. And for those of you who are familiar with Illuminate, this is like a test, raise your hand. So lots of hands being raised there. Thank you very much. But I see there's a number of people who might not be familiar with Illuminate. Let's take a look at the interface. On the screen, this is the whiteboard area that you see here. This is the whiteboard area that I'm highlighting right now. And that's where the majority of the presentation materials will be. At one point today, we're going to ask you to use the highlighter. So I'm pointing it out to you now. See where this thing says click the highlighter and select a color? The highlighter button is going to be right up here. It's flashing now, or there's a flashing thing close to it. And as we get to that point in the webinar, we're going to ask everyone to pick up the highlighter, and you're going to choose a color and draw on the screen. That's coming up later on. We haven't given you the access to it right now. We're going to do that later. So look for that opportunity later on to come and use the highlighter for all of us as we work with our presenter. Now, an important feature of the seminar, as many people know, is the chat window, and that's the point where you get to insert your comments or questions. And remember, everyone can see these. I'm going to keep track of these questions so we can address them as time permits during the Q&A breaks and at the very end. Notice also the participant box. You can see that up on the left here, where you can see everyone who's logged into this webinar. You might notice some colleagues, and it's okay to send them a personal note. But remember, the moderator and the presenters see all the comments typed into the chat box, so be careful what you say there. Now, during the webinar, we're going to have an opportunity to do some polling. The polling buttons are right up here on the top of the screen. Of course, not where I'm pointing to, but if you look just above the list of the participants, you'll see the polling things called A, B, and C there. So when we ask you to respond to a polling question, please use that way upper bar there to indicate the A, B, and C. And finally, right below the participants box are the emoticons. Now I'm pointing to them on my screen, and of course they're to the left. If you're asked to raise your hand, you can do so by clicking on the raise your hand arrow, or you can indicate whatever emotions you're feeling if you would like to. Now let's start by giving a round of applause. So use the applause emoticon there to welcome our presenter as I introduce him. Very good. Now today we're very fortunate to have as our presenter Carl Kapp. Now Carl's a professor of instructional technology at Bloomsburg University in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. And Carl's the author of 4 books and currently working on his 5th one. I'm familiar with some of his better-known books. One I think is pretty cool is Gadgets, Games, and Gizmos for Learning. And as we mentioned, Carl's currently working on his 5th book, and the title of it is pretty apropos to this morning's session. It's called The Gamification of Learning and Instruction. A lot of the material in that book is part of the seminar for this morning, and it's due to be released on Amazon in the spring of 2012, so it's coming up. In addition to writing books, Carl teaches a graduate level course called Instructional Game Design, and he's co-PI on a National Science Foundation grant entitled Simulation and Modeling in Technology Education. So it's a pretty cool background here of the presenter. You can see he's really interested in things like design of gameplay, combining pedagogy with fun and interactive game activities. So welcome, Carl. We're really pleased to have you this morning.
Thanks, Mike. I'm glad to be here. And I'm not really in sunny Phoenix, but I am in sunny Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. So even though it's a brisk 45 degrees here, it's a beautiful day, and I'm glad that so many people have taken time out of their day to attend the webinar. So I want to go ahead and get started and talk about some really kind of, I think, some interesting things that we can do from an instructional standpoint and add game elements to our classroom. So I'm going to talk really about 4 areas. So the first is, how do we get to this point? You know, why do we think games are appropriate in the classroom environment, and what really is going to make a difference? And then why are we here? So we're going to talk a little bit about why are we at this position? Second, I want to talk about what is gamification, how do we know what that is and how that works. So we're going to talk a little bit about the definition. 3, we're going to talk about, you know, are games really instructional and educational? Are they really going to help? And then finally, we're going to talk about how games impact learning. Are they effective tools for transferring knowledge? And I'll give that one away now. I think that they are effective tools for transferring knowledge, and we're going to talk about that in the next few moments. But before we do that, I want to find out a little bit about who's in the audience. So if you have a minute, could you tell me what topics you primarily teach? So take a minute and just write in the chat box what you primarily teach. Okay, I see some public speaking, some instructional design, fantastic. Political science, pilot training, some more instructional designers, nursing I see, manufacturing engineering. Okay, great. So a wide variety of topics. Now the good news is that any one of these topics, from green and sustainability to electronic engineering to nursing to instructional design, we can use game-based techniques for conveying knowledge. So let's look at our gamers, if you will. And so this is the typical viewpoint that we think when we think of a couple gamers. And there's some really interesting things about gamers that we need to know before we can divide instruction for them. So one is they play about 13 hours. The average teen in the United States plays about 13 hours a week of console games. So that's your Xbox 360, that's your Wii, that's your PlayStation 3, those types of platforms. And 87% of 8 to 17-year-olds play video games at home. So almost 90% of the homes in the United States have some kind of access to video games, whether those video games are on a console, as we found out earlier, or if they're on a computer or something like that as well. 10,000 hours of gameplay is about the average time a student plays games until they get to college. Now this is really kind of an interesting number, because 10,000 hours is about the same number as research indicates it takes somebody to become an expert in a certain area. You know, Malcolm Gladwell talks about this in a couple of his books, and Jane McGonigal talks about it in a few of her books. And so the idea is 10,000 hours of effort is going to make you an expert. So the question that we have for the gamers is, what are they experts in? That's really kind of what we want to come up with. And some of you may say, well, they're experts in wasting time. But actually there's some other really interesting things that they do that aren't wasting time. But a lot of people say, well, hey, they're lazy, they're rotting their brain playing video games, they're antisocial, they're wasting their time. But really, that's not true. They're, number one, problem solvers. And how do we know that game players are problem solvers? Well, we know they're problem solvers because you can't get to level 2 of a game unless you can solve a problem. So there's definitely some concepts that they're learning as they're playing these games, and one is problem solving. So that's something that we really want to keep in mind as we're working with students, because they like to be challenged with problems. So what can we do to help introduce problems to our students? Second is they're very confident. Some would say overconfident. Their model is fail forward fast. So what they do in a video game is you try something out right away. You don't study it. You don't examine it. You just run your player across the field and find out whether or not he gets shot. Or you run after the dragon and find out where the weakness of the dragon is. Now, it may take you 10, 20 times to do that, but you keep going forward with a sense of confidence. You're actually trying to perform a task in a game before you've mastered it. Now think of instruction, think of education. What we try to do is you try to get somebody to master something, and then we have them apply it, especially in the classroom. Let's say we're teaching leadership, for example, or nursing, or green or something. We teach all the concepts, the models, all that kind of stuff, and then we let a person practice. But in a game environment, we let the person practice first, and we give them corrective feedback as they go along. And that seems to be a really effective way of conveying knowledge. And gamers are social. Now most people will say to me, Carl, really, gamers are social? They sit in the basement all by themselves and they don't talk to anybody. Well, the truth of the matter is they're talking to lots of people in that basement. My wife came downstairs one time and my son was sitting playing a game RuneScape in front of his computer. And she said to him, hey, I want you to get up off of that chair. I want you to go next door and play with your friend Mike. You haven't seen him all morning. He turns to her and says, Mom, I've been playing with Mike for the past 4 hours. They were playing together in an online game. So they're actually much more social. And if you look how they play console games, they'll get in a circle and they'll play the game and they'll say, oh, well, you're better at this, so you do this part. Oh, you're not really good, so why don't you try the easy part? So it's actually very much a social activity, even though we tend to not think of it as social. We talked about it before. They're very resilient. It's the fail forward fast. It's the level of confidence. Failure in a game is part of the gameplay. It's not something to be ashamed of or embarrassed about. Now think of education again. Failure in education, failure to know an answer, failure to give the correct response, has devastating effects in a classroom. Well, maybe devastating is a little bit over the top there, but has negative effects in a classroom as compared to a game. So somebody doesn't want to volunteer an answer because they're afraid they'll be wrong. They don't want to try to guess because they're afraid they're not going to be right. There's a couple of students that are always guessing and always want to be in front, but for the majority of them, no. But in a game, they say, well, let me take a chance. Let me try to jump across the ravine. I don't know if I can make it or not, but I'm going to try. Well, could we do the same thing with our students? Could we get them to try to give us an answer, try to think of the topic before they actually do, and do it in a way that doesn't penalize them for failure? And finally, the gamers think that they're multitasking. Now, there's a bunch of research about multitasking. Most of it says no, humans, they can't really multitask. We think we can multitask, but we can't really multitask. But gamers like to think they can do multitasking. So we need to kind of be aware of that a little bit as we go there. Are there other dangers of using games in the classroom? Well, like any instructional technique, there are dangers. So for example, a technique of asking students questions, okay, who knows the answer to A? Well, the danger there is some students will raise their hand and answer the questions, and some students don't. I don't know if everybody knows the answer or not. There's a danger in using tests. Some students do well on tests. Some students don't do well on tests. There's a danger in using hands-on applications. Some students will hurt themselves if they're not oversighted very carefully, or if there's not very careful oversight. So yeah, there are some dangers of using games in the classroom. For instance, if people only focus on the game and not the instructional output, there's definitely dangers there. But for the most part, they can be mitigated, and we're going to talk about some of that as we go through. So, and most people, one other thing I want to talk about is most people say, well, it's just boys that play games. You know, females don't really play games. It's just a kind of a male thing. That's not true at all. In fact, 43% of gamers are female, and 26% of those females are over the age of 18. So females are gaming just as much as males are. In fact, females play 5 hours a week of console games, so not as many, you know, Wii or Nintendo, but they play more PC games. In fact, 63% of PC gamers are female. So when people say to me, oh, it's only a male phenomenon, that's not true at all. The environments tend to be a little bit different, but the activities tend to be the same. So for example, from 2004 to 2006, I think, the hottest selling PC game during that time period was Barbie Fashion Princess. And in that game, you basically, it was definitely a female targeted game. You definitely got a princess and you dressed her up. You put a dress on and put some makeup on her, and you did her hair, and you put earrings on, all that kind of stuff. So somebody say, well, that's pretty much of a female, you know, kind of focused game and doing female kind of stuff. But that's not true. When I play Madden NFL 2012 with my son, we spend the first 10 minutes, he picks his football player. He decides how long his pants should be, how many tattoos he's going to have. He's going to have this black little makeup under his eyes. He's going to have a 5 o'clock shadow. So he's actually doing the same kind of tasks, just in a different environment. So the tasks, I would argue, are not the same. I would say the tasks are the same. What's different is basically the content or the context. But so are games effective for learning? So this was a study done of video game / simulations by a woman named Tracy Sitzman, and she looked at 65 studies. So this was a meta-analysis. So it was a study of studies. And she found that compared to traditional instruction, students had 11% higher declarative knowledge with a game-based environment. Now, declarative is learning facts, figures, that kind of stuff. They had a 14% higher procedural knowledge and a 9% overall retention rate. So you might look at this and say, wow, this is fantastic. You know, the very next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go out and I'm going to throw a game in the classroom. But that's not really what the study found. Yes, there were increases, but those increases weren't just because it was a game. The increases were because of the high level of interactivity. It was the instructional method. So if you take something and say, okay, I'm just going to give you 5 points for answering the spelling question correctly, it's not going to have the same kind of impact as if you're engaging them in an activity. Like there's a really cool game. I don't know if anybody's played this. So anybody played, you could type it in if you had, a typing game called Zombies, Typing of the Dead. Typing of the Dead is the name of the game.
Oh, wait a minute, I got to try that one. I haven't done that one yet, Carl.
Typing of the Dead.
Yeah.
And the cool thing about Typing of the Dead is basically you're being attacked by zombies, and so you have to type in these words. But it gives you a practical reason why to study typing. And it's actually really effective and a lot of fun. So if anybody has time, not now, but you may want to play that game.
Wait, before we do this poll, can we go back one, which I got a quick question.
Oh, sure, yeah, no problem.
There's these 65 studies that are mentioned here in her work. Are they across the whole spectrum of people? I mean, this is a K through 20 sort of range, or is it all high school, or you have a sense of?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's actually, she wanted to do, so it's not high school, so it's 18 and above.
Okay.
So she wanted to actually see, because there's a lot of research actually on students and games, and really they come to the same conclusion, and there's several conclusions. One is a game has to be embedded in the curriculum to be effective.
Yes.
So you can't simply just throw out a game there and say, okay, you guys go learn from the game. You have to kind of set it up. You have to debrief it. You have to go through the instructional methods that way. 2 is that you should give learners unfettered access to the game. So let them play it, whenever they want to.
Yes.
And 3, it has to have a high level of interactivity where the tasks in the game relate to the learning outcomes. Otherwise, people get so caught up in the winning the game that they don't learn anything, which is a big, Laura asked before, which is a big danger in that students are really, really clever. So if they can find a way to win the game without doing the instructional part,
yes.
they'll do it.
Yes, cool.
So you want to try to do that.
All right,
yeah, that was a good question. Good. Okay, so next we have a poll, and I just want to know, which do you think builds more confidence for on-the-job application of learned knowledge? Is it classroom instruction, simulation, game, or neither are beneficial?
So participants, you now go up above Carl's name in the participant window and you see the ABC there. Click on A, B, or C. Don't type them in the chat box. Just click on one of those buttons up there. I think I'm going to do this too. Builds more confidence. Oh, I think I know what the answer is. Okay.
Seems like there's a high degree of consensus.
Well, let's run the poll. Oh, there's the results of the poll right there, and we're going to move it down right a bit. Thank you very much. So yeah, you look there's a strong consensus around simulation, huh?
Yeah, 54%, and then 27 people saying neither of them work.
Well, they didn't really say that. They just didn't vote. They're going to abstain from voting here. Right. So it's not a neither in this case.
I thought it was kind of funny though. Like, yeah, we don't need to do anything. Okay, so actually the right answer is simulation game. So a lot of stuff we do in the classroom, but really simulation game, and in fact, she found it was a 20% higher feeling of confidence. So what that really tells us is that if we can simulate in kind of an interactive manner something that happens, for example, in nursing, maybe it's a code, or maybe it's reacting to a patient having a seizure or something. Rather than reading about that, if we could actually have one of those mannequins and actually go through a process of reacting to that, that would give us far more confidence in being able to handle that situation when we actually encounter it than just kind of reading in a textbook. And we kind of know all this, but what has happened a lot in education is I think we've extracted it. We've extracted concepts and ideas further away from the actual doing of the process. Now the great thing is community colleges still are really focused on hands-on and application, which I think is wonderful. As you get to some other academic institutions, they're not so hands-on. And what we really need to do, I think, is get back to the hands-on and make exercises more realistic. And we'll talk about that as well. So here is kind of what I was talking about, where we have an individual, we have the classroom, but how do we really apply that to on the job? So how do we take the concepts in the classroom, which maybe we're not as confident about, and then apply them and be more confident as we're actually doing the process? And that's what we want from our students. And one way to do that is called gamification. So gamification is a term that you may hear. It's being kind of battered around a little bit as a term. And it's a little controversial because a number of people think, oh, gamification means we just add a badge or a reward or something, and we can get people to do things they don't really want to do. We'll just gamify it. And that's not really the case at all. What really gamification means is that we use game-based mechanics, aesthetics, game thinking to encourage people, motivate action, promote learning, and solve problems. So I really think of it as using game-based thinking to help people solve problems and promote learning. And there's several ways that we can do that. But before we get any further, that's kind of the setup, if you will, why we're here, how we got here. Are there any questions about any of that content before I continue? And if you have one, just go ahead and type it in the text chat.
Carl, we've had several questions that have come in. One person has some experience using Jeopardy-style games in her classroom, and she thinks that works pretty well. Wondered if you had any comments on that, and also how about some other games that you could name that you think might be particularly effective? So number one, do you think Jeopardy is any good? And And then number 2, how about some other ones?
What are some other ones? Okay, so that's a really good question. So is Jeopardy any good? I think one of the things that we need to think about with games are that different games focus on different types of content. So is Jeopardy good for higher level thinking skills? The answer is no,
right,
because it doesn't really require that. However, it's great for declarative knowledge, reinforcement of knowledge, and repetition of knowledge. So let's say that I have a category periodic table. Well, the Jeopardy game in that case is a really good trigger to have me remember the symbols in the periodic table and bring those up. That's great. It's not so good for having me apply 2 chemicals together to get a chemical reaction. You could say, hey, what 2 chemicals give me this chemical reaction? And that's a little bit of higher level thinking that you could get to, but those would have to be very carefully written questions to get to that example. Some games that I think are really kind of interesting from a learning perspective. Let's say we wanted to teach leadership, for example. Well, there's a really interesting game called World of Warcraft,
yes,
in which somebody has to become a leader and lead a guild on adventures.
yes.
And so if you want to teach leadership, I think World of Warcraft is a great petri dish for leadership. In fact, there was an article in the 2003 Harvard Business Review that talked about leadership labs using World of Warcraft. If you teach courses like history, great games are like Civilization V is a great game. And NSF creates some good games. Debbie talked about Immunitac, created by the American Federation of Scientists, and with some funding from the National Science Foundation. That's a great game. Another game is Atlantis, which is a good game.
Do you know any engineering stuff?
Yeah, it's kind of a simulation / game called West Point Bridge Design.
West Point Bridge Design, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and it's actually a game developed by the people at West Point. And you create a bridge and you drive a truck across it, and you see whether or not your bridge holds or if it falls apart.
I like it.
Yeah.
I've got one more question in this time period. It's one actually that interests me very much too, because I'm always looking for innovative ways to do quizzes. You tell students, okay, time for a pop quiz, and there's just groans. But maybe games can be used as a quiz mechanism as well. What do you think?
They definitely can. I talk a little bit later about audience response or student response systems.
Oh, yeah.
Which are a great way to quiz students without really quizzing students. And so you ask them a question and they answer. You can see how everybody's doing. And the interesting thing about that is, 1, it gives immediate feedback, and 2, it allows the students to see where their knowledge is related to other people. The other thing that you could do with quizzes is a lot of times we'll do like a multiple choice type quiz.
Yeah.
But depending on the topic that you teach, you could set it up as a scenario or a sequence of tasks and find out how they would react into the sequence. And so that way you could actually assess their knowledge of applying the content rather than just their knowledge.
Right.
And people always seem to be much more interested in application and how they can apply something.
You know what? Good, Carl. In the interest of time, let's go forward. There's a couple of interesting questions about, if you try to develop a game yourself, where do you get the resources from it? Let's come back to those at the end. I'll save those on my tally sheet here and come back to them. Why don't you go ahead?
Okay, great. Whoops,
You got excited there.
I got excited about all that good stuff. One thing I do want to mention as well, in the sheet that accompanies this webinar, there are a list of a number of softwares. So I believe if somebody wants to kind of develop their own, there's some really good software that you can do that. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on as we go through.
Oh, and we'll reference how to get that sheet. I think it was sent out to everybody, but it's also going to be posted as well. So we'll mention that at the end.
Great. The one thing, just one more quick thing. Unfortunately, there's not a central repository of all educational games. I wish there were, but there's not. But I will also post some links on my blog to some entries I have from before that lists like a lot of cool games. Like if you're doing a dissection, there's Frog Guts.
Oh, I know that one. Yeah.
Kind of simulation. Yeah. So what kind of games can we do in our classrooms? So what I want to say here is what kind of techniques can we take from the classroom, from games and put into our classroom? So one is provide a challenge. Start that way. Two, tell a story. Be a strategy guide rather than a game strategy guide rather than a didactic instructor. Appeal to player types, provide feedback, award experience points. We typically award things just for performance, but experience is important as well. And add cooperation and competition, which games have. So let's look at some things. First, provide a challenge. So how we teach, and we do this even at the corporate level, which is crazy. I was working with a client one time and they said, hey, we are training investigators to investigate things that happen in our company, and they're not doing as good a job as we would like. I said, well, let me see your course. So they had a course, and it was a beautifully laid out course. It started with the objectives, and they had a model of how to investigate, then they had an example of an investigation, and then they had a role play, which they almost never got to that role play because they ran out of time. I said, yes, Tom, very good. So I said, let's flip this around. So when the students first walk into the classroom, let's tell them, you're a manager in this department, $10,000 has just been embezzled, figure out what happened. And so they kind of look at you like, well, what do you mean? Well, who would you talk to? Okay, give me a list. What kind of questions would you ask them? So we totally flipped it from sequence of this is what you do first, this is what you do second, this is what you do third, and we changed it to the fact that, look, you have a problem, a challenge, now you have to solve it. So when you think of your instruction, think of how you can challenge your students right away. We all love challenges. We all like to try to solve challenges. So by instead of using objectives, let's use a challenge to get our learners involved in the process. So here's a game, Oregon Trail. The challenge of Oregon Trail is, of course, to reach Oregon, right? But actually, that really wasn't the overall challenge. The overall challenge was survive. How can I survive this trip and come out without being crushed? So we can take things like how do you, for sustainability, the challenge is how do you create wind-based power? But the ultimate survival is how do we wean ourselves from oil for future sustainability? So we can kind of ratchet up different levels of challenges and have our students tackle a smaller challenge in context of an even larger challenge and get them excited about it. Whereas Carmen Sandiego was a great game. And in particular, this game was to teach people geography, which I didn't see geography on the list, but it's usually not somebody's like, oh, this is really cool geography. Why is that? Well, because geography is taught memorization. You memorize all the states and all the capitals. I mean, when I was in grade school, I was really upset that the South lost the war. And my mom one day said, well, why are you upset that the South lost the Civil War? I said, because I wouldn't have to memorize 50 states and 50 capitals. I'd only have to memorize like 25. So my mom's like, yeah. She didn't really appreciate that thinking, but and really no one else has either. But the point was that's how they were teaching geography. But think of if they taught geography like the Great Race, right? The Amazing Race. You had to figure out how to get from Venezuela to the Netherlands, and you had to figure out, well, what would you visit in the Netherlands? Where would you go? Where's the capital? Where's the population density? Then all of a sudden that becomes a little bit more interesting and a little more exciting. And there's just another Carmen Sandiego. But we can do that in the classroom. We can challenge a group to solve a problem. Maybe they already know what tools they can use to solve the problem. Maybe they don't know what tools they need to solve the problem. Maybe they know what knowledge they need. Maybe they don't know what knowledge they need. But we can challenge them. One of the things that I do is I teach a class called Managing Multimedia Projects. And in that class, I present students with a request for proposal. So I say to my students, okay, you've got to develop an e-learning for a fictitious company, and the e-learning has to involve 14 modules, and they have to be on this topic. So I want how you would develop them, I want to know what your management plan is. I want to know what your budget is. And you have 50 pages to write that document. And this is a graduate level course. And we actually have people from the field come and evaluate them. So all semester they're trying to figure out how to solve the problem, which is to create this instruction. So years ago somebody said, I'm not sure that that would work in my classroom. I don't teach graduate level courses, can't do problem-based. This year I got a call from one of my former students who said, Dr. Kopp, I'm teaching 6th grade students conservation. I want you to come in and talk about how to respond to a request for proposal. I said, Anthony, they're 6th graders. What are they going to know? He goes, no, we're doing this whole unit. We already went out. We saw the place. They have to do a proposal for how to conserve water in our township. And they did studies on water usage. They did studies on brushing their teeth using water. And then those students had to write a proposal, and they had to present it to people from the community. So think of any subject matter, whether it's electrical engineering, whether it's nursing, whether it's whatever. The nursing might be, I want you to propose the development of a new technique to deal with a heart attack. Or I want you to propose methods for helping a patient feel more at home. Or we could say electrical engineering, here's this problem, at this plant, these machinery isn't lighting properly, you've got to figure out what the issue is. Or write a proposal to develop a plan to electrify this grid, or whatever it happens to be, the subject matter expert. We can challenge our learners with the problem, and they could work on that problem all semester. What that does is it puts them in the context of using their knowledge. So what a game does really well is put you in the context of using the knowledge. And what we could do as instructors is put them in the context. So if I know I'm working on this, I'm learning about, for example, soil erosion because I'm solving this larger problem about conservation of water toward the end of the semester, I'm going to be more in tune. It kind of solves the old algebra problem. And the old algebra problem I always had with algebra was they would say to me, if a train left the station at 5 o'clock going 60 miles an hour, what time would it arrive at the next town? And my problem was, and we had to figure it out, my problem was, well, how come I wouldn't look at the train schedule? Why wouldn't I just figure out what time the train's supposed to arrive? So the context didn't work for me. But if you would say, okay, you're going to leave your house at 6 o'clock, your friend is going to leave his house at 6 o'clock, he has to travel 80 miles, you have to travel 9 miles, and you're getting together for an important meeting with the client, figure out what time you guys have to leave to get there, that puts it in a context. So think about the context and think about this proposal challenge. Could you challenge your learners with finding evidence, doing research, making observations to solve a realistic problem? And one of the ways I get those problems is I go back to alumni and I say, what problems are you dealing with in the field? And they give me problems and I use those problems. So they're realistic, they're focused, and they use the content that I've taught in class. So that's a good way to think about that. Another great way is to tell a story. This is a video game called the Bourne Conspiracy video game, and this is another image from the Bourne Conspiracy video game, and this looks like an image from the Bourne Conspiracy video game, but it's actually from the Defense Intelligence Agency. So they use video-based stories, game-based stories to teach. And in fact, we know from research that stories, let me find this, and I'll go back, that stories actually help people remember information better than if they learn it in a bulleted list. So think about how many people teach, right? They have bulleted lists of things students need to learn. But actually, if they could embed them in a story about what's happening in the field, they're going to remember them more accurately. So think about how you can do that for your students so your students can remember content more accurately. Think about stories of the field. humans have a natural affinity for narrative constructions, so we need to create narrative constructions to have the students become part of the learning process. If you think about a body of knowledge is evidence, information, research, and stories about how that knowledge is applied to solve problems, like engineering problems. You know, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, how do we straighten it out? That's a great engineering problem for students to encounter.
Hey, Carl, I could actually testify here, not that you asked me to, but you know, when I talk about safety sometimes in my chemistry classes, I used to start with a bulleted list of do's and don'ts. And then I abandoned that and started telling stories about the time a student's hair caught on fire and things like that. They paid just much more attention to what was going on. I couldn't believe the raptness of the class on the story side versus the bulleted list. So.
Great. Well, thanks, Mark. Yeah, that's a great technique. I mean, it really focuses people's attention and they remember it.
Yeah.
And stories don't have to be elaborate. You know, if you ever played this game, if anybody remembers Missile Command, it had a very simple text, just missiles falling on cities. And people kind of created their own story about it was an alien planet, or it was a nuclear war, or it was a moon base, or anything like that. And what this really allows you to do is shows the power of stories. Having students write their own story sometimes helps. The other thing that I do with my class, when I have the alumni bring back problems, I tell students when they're in my class, hey, you're not really done with this class till you bring back a story that we can use in class. And that kind of keeps the pipeline going of stories and interesting problems that students face. Here's a great site called edheads.org for medical training. Now, I'm not a doctor, and I don't play one on TV, so I don't know how medically accurate it is, but it seems to be very accurate. And they have hip replacement process. They have a knee replacement process. And so definitely, if you can, check this out. It's edheads.org, and that's on the sheet of paper as well. But it really kind of walks you through a medical process and the kind of decisions that somebody would need to make in that particular position. So I think that's kind of a neat tool that can be used. Stories really provide the context, the meaning, the purpose, and of course you need, you know, characters, you need a plot, you need some tension, resolution, and a conclusion. So basically what you need from a story, and adding those to the instructional process can be very, very powerful. The other thing that's really powerful is having learners create their own stories. So this is a software called Thinking Worlds. It's available for free for educational institutions, thinkingworlds.com, and it provides already set up 3D characters, already set up hospitals, already set up office buildings. I think it's got a factory. So really some interesting things you can add and have your students create, based on the story, create little instructional interactions, little branching simulations. So it really gives an opportunity for students to jump right in and do that. And of course, here's the website for it, thinkingworlds.com. And of course another one is Unity 3D. I saw somebody mention Second Life. That's a great platform as well. It gives you the ability to build within that world very simply, very easily, get students on board. So I use Second Life quite extensively. But if you want some kind of standalone games, things like Unity 3D are a good one to develop as well. Again, it's free. It does take a while to learn to program it, but if you're teaching a programming class or if you have students that have a proclivity to programming, that can work as well. One of the things that we do here is we partner programming students with other students who maybe have the story idea or the content and get them to work together to create something. Next, I think one thing you want to think about is being a strategy guide. And the thing about strategy guides are they don't typically give you the answer. They give you a direction to look into. And that becomes really kind of important for learning. I think oftentimes as instructors we like to give out the answers. That's kind of what we do. But what we should really give out are vague hints. Think about a video game. If you're not doing really well at first, after a certain time the game gives you some kind of vague hint. oh, look to your left. And that's all that it would give. And then maybe it gets a little more specific. Look to your left underneath rocks. And then finally, if you're not getting it, it says, okay, here's where you need to look. So think about, as students are asking questions about the challenge that you've given them encased in this story, they might say, well, what about this? Well, what do you think? Or well, you give me some options. And allow the student to kind of work through that process, because that's how the games work. Games don't give you the answer. They give you vague hints, and then they give you more specific, and then finally the answer. So it really forces the learner to go through some cognitive processing before they actually are given the answer. Another one is to appeal to all type of players. So we tend to think, games one size fit all, but actually different games teach different content. Jeopardy's great for declarative knowledge. World of Warcraft's a little bit better for problem-based knowledge. Engineering knowledge, West Point bridge design. So appeal to different types of players. So you might say, well, what are the different types of players? Well, there are 4 types of players, and I'm going to let you in a moment self-identify. There are things that happen in the world. So there are, of course, players in the world, and there are, of course, the world. And then you could act in the world, or you could interact in the world. So at the intersections, we have different things happening. So for example, in, let's say, the killers. Killers are people that play games to cause mischief. They can do things they can't do in real life. So they're kind of, sometimes in Second Life they're called the griefers. They're the people that not really allowing you a whole lot of freedom, and they kind of wreak havoc in a game. So they like to act on the players. Then most players, or many players, are achievers. They like to accomplish the goals of the game. They like to rescue the princess. They like to collect the most coins. They're the ones that want to achieve the most. Then you have people in games that are mostly there because they're socializers. They like to talk to the other people. They like to interact with the other people. They don't care that much for the progress of the game. They're in there for the social aspects. And finally, you have explorers. And they're the people that play the game that know every little nook and cranny of the game. They found all the Easter eggs. They know that, hey, if you go here and do this and this and this, a secret door opens. And they like to explore the environment and see what it's all about. So this is the time in the session that Mike talked about earlier, where you're going to take a drawing tool, and I want you just to, we'll take the, I think the highlighter tool.
Yeah, the second, that highlighter right there, second from the top. Click on that.
And just put an X on what type of player you think you are. Are you an achiever? Are you a killer? Are you a socializer or an explorer? So I'll give you a moment to do that.
I got to choose my color too. I like blue. Can I put more than one X?
All right. Of course the giant killer is going to put a big X. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Oh, this is good. I don't see that many killers.
Now, usually they're not. They're the smallest percentage, but they wreak the most havoc. Because they're not really out for the goals of the game. They're out for what kind of things can I do to other people. And you're always going to have students like that. So you kind of need to kind of rein them in, if you will. I see we have a lot of achievers. A lot of people are achievers, especially faculty members. We're at the places where we are because we like to achieve. Lots of explorers because we also like to figure things out and figure out what's going on. I see not quite as many socializers. But one of the things you want to think about is having a game in a classroom, you need to have at least 3 of the quadrants, and sometimes even 4. Be aware of the 4th quadrant.
Oh, we're having too much fun here. I'm going to close the thing.
Okay.
Okay, good. That was fun.
Excuse me. Allowing people to kind of do this. Allow people to socialize. Allow people to be achievers. Allow people to explore the environment. So when you create the game type environment, keep that in mind so that people can go through those activities. All right, great. So let's go to the next slide.
Okay.
And this one is about feedback. And you really want to have feedback. And one of the things games do almost better than anything else is to provide continual feedback. In a classroom, hold on one second.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I had to clear my throat there.
Yeah.
In the classroom, a student typically doesn't get immediate feedback on how quickly or how slowly they're gaining information. They get feedback when we give them a quiz or when we test them or something, but they don't get continual corrective feedback. What we really want to think about is games give continual feedback. You always know how you're doing. So if I'm playing Pac-Man, I know how many dots I have left. I know how close the ghosts are. I know how many pills I've eaten. So I've got all that feedback information known. So one of the things that you really want to think about is, how can I give more feedback? And here's another kind of a fun game. This is from actually Tim the Toolman, which is a handy hammer challenge. But notice the thing I like about this is I got feedback right away whether or not I hit the nail dead center, or if I bent the nail, or if I drove the nail in properly. So again, very realistic feedback about how I'm doing, kind of a game-based environment. So one of the ways that you can get continual feedback in a classroom, or frequent feedback in a classroom, is through an audience response system. I don't have a poll or anything, but if you use an audience response system in your classroom, just pop a little note in the chat, and we can see if anybody does that. But basically what an audience response system does is everybody gets yeah, we use Turning Point as well, is a system where you grab a little controller. It looks like a remote controller. Some of them are really thin. That look almost like a credit card. And you can set up questions. And there's a bunch of different tools to do this. And students pick it up pretty quickly. And what you can do then in a lecture, you can embed questions and get feedback from students real time. And I use this several ways. One, I'll use it sometimes to get to misunderstandings. So I'll say, how many people think, that females don't play games? And I'll get some kind of number, and I'll go, okay, let's see what the real number is. And so it's a really good way to have students predict outcomes and to measure their previous knowledge. It's another good tool, for example, to keep them engaged, so you can know how many people have clicked in, how many people haven't clicked in. You can even, if you want, connect them to attendance, so you can know if people are actually in your class or not, depending on the size of your class. Here is a typical example of measuring. I use this for the alumni too. Okay, we had this proposal. Do you think the overall scope was feasible, yes or no? And so here you can see 64% of the people said yes, and then 36% of the people said no. And then what I do is I actually will say, okay, well, why do you say no? And you can drill in deeper to some of the answers and some of the things that are going on. So that gives you a really powerful real-time feedback tool to do that. Now let's say that you don't have a clicker. You could do that with raising of hands, or sometimes I've done red, yellow, green. So if you think the answer is, if you think this is the answer, put up your red card. If you think it's wrong, put up the yellow card. If you think it's right, put up the green card. If you think it's wrong, put up the red card. If you're not sure, put up the yellow card. So you don't have to actually have to use clickers to get a sense of that type of feedback in class. So using that kind of continual feedback will work. Sometimes I can even, online tools are nice because they have like a slow down or speed up feature, the thumbs up, the thumbs down, the clapping, the raising of the hand. But you can do that in class. You can say, look, if I'm going too fast, hold up the yellow. And just hold it up so I can see it. You don't have to hold it up so everybody can see it. And then I'll know that I'm going a little bit too quickly. So you can actually kind of gauge where the students are in the class by using those different colors. So that's a technique that you can think about using as well. The other thing is peer-to-peer feedback. So oftentimes what we'll do is involve students in giving feedback to other students about the proposal. And a really neat process you can use is if you teach a model to someone, then, so I've done this several times, and every time it amazes me. So we'll go over a model, we'll teach maybe the instructional design model. And then I'll say, okay, now that I've taught you this model, turn to a fellow classmate and teach them that model. And at first all students will look at me like, Dr. Kopp, what are you doing? We just learned this model. Why do we have to teach it again? I say, trust me, just teach somebody this model. And when they teach the model, it's fascinating. They embellish it with their own information, so they're putting it in their own words. They will say to me, oh, I thought I knew this section of the model, but I don't know this section. I need to learn more about it. It reinforces what they already know, and it really helps them figure out their level of knowledge and gives them immediate feedback on their knowledge of the model. And then the really interesting thing is that they say, okay, now the persons that were taught it before, teach somebody else the model. And they're like, Dr. Kopp, we just learned it twice. This isn't gonna, and it does the same thing. Now, I've never taken it beyond the second one. But I found that a really good technique for promoting peer-to-peer learning is to have each student teach a model to the students. And you could, if you want to, you could up the stakes by saying, okay, I'm going to give a candy bar to the person that, taught it the best, or that memorized all of it, or whatever. You can kind of do that stuff, but you don't even need to do that. It's just a really striking technique for helping students share knowledge with each other. Now, this gets to the award experience points. So, I have to back up. In a game, there are, like World of Warcraft, there's treasure. So you can get the treasure, for example, if you divide it up. In World of Warcraft, you have to go with a group of people. So maybe there's not really enough treasure to break it up equally for everybody. And what they do then is they say, look, in this guild, what we're going to do is the more raids you go on, the more help you provide, the more you're active, we'll give you what's called the experience points. And we'll add up the experience points. And at the end, when we get a treasure or a loot or in the process, the people that have the most experience points will get a higher percentage because you've participated more, you've been involved more, you've been doing more. And so it encourages people to do things that don't necessarily always have a reward, but allow you to apply the reward. And same type of thing. In a learning environment, that's like you show up for participation. But what if somebody reads, you can encourage them to read an extra article, take this little quiz, we'll give you some experience points. If you go and do this particular activity, you'll get some experience points. So basically what you can do is you can provide a motivation to do learning-based activities above and beyond what's done in the classroom. Bring in a cool example, or bring something in from the local paper about engineering, or go on and do the West Point Bridge contest on your own, not part of the class, and then come and explain it to the class. Will give you some experience points. So the idea is to provide and to show them other educational outlets. We've all had students who say, is this going to be on the test? And you say no, and they're like, well, I don't care then. So you're going to have a percentage of that. But you're also going to have students that are interested in the topic. And what we want to do as instructors is really motivate them for a kind of lifelong learning, right? We want to really get them involved and excited about the learning process. And so by awarding these experience points, it can really help people get excited about learning about the field through other areas. Through maybe it's journals, maybe it's conferences, maybe it's local events. Those kinds of things can be very motivational to the students. So think about experience points, and there's actually a professor at a college who teaches game design, and he's redeveloped his entire course just based around experience points. So I don't know if I would go that far, but the concept of rewarding academic endeavors without a grade, just with some kind of participation, is kind of a worthwhile thing to follow. Now, another topic to think about, solution 7 here, is adding competition and cooperation. Companies that compete with one another, they call it coopetition. So there are two companies that compete, but yet they cooperate. And maybe students can look at it like coopetition as well. But basically, it's the idea of collaboration to achieve mutual goals. And one of the ways that you can do that is posting leaderboards. if there's certain tasks or projects, what team or person happens to be ahead in the leaderboard. Now, oftentimes people say, well, leaderboards, I'm not really comfortable with posting students up on a wide leaderboard so that all students can see every other student's score on or work on a project or whatever. And I agree with that. That's not always the best thing to do. In fact, what really helps learners or others be motivated is have a leaderboard with your friends. So you might have a leaderboard that shows, there's always somebody in school who's like the super valedictorian who does everything right. Like, I can never compete with that person. So it's actually demotivating to compete with them. But my 3 friends, we kind of have a rivalry, and we'd like to see how we do. And we kind of compete with each other. Well, we set up where learners have elected to be on leaderboards with their fellow friends or students. And those leaderboards give them feedback on what's happening just in that small circle. So that's one way to use a leaderboard to motivate people to do well, but without putting them up to the giant general public or the entire classroom where they may or may not be competing as well. So think about that as kind of a way for motivating players and allowing them to receive feedback on their performance. If you could have a leaderboard on a daily basis to find out how you're doing, and maybe you don't want to call it leaderboard, maybe call it a status board or a performance board or experience board or whatever, and maybe that just gives the learners insight into where they are. It gives them more continual feedback. Because people can make adjustments based on continual feedback, but when we do intermediate feedback, as we do in many classrooms, it doesn't have a direct effect on the behavior because it's too delayed. We as humans really need feedback shortly after we do a behavior to know whether or not we've done the behavior correctly, and then to reinforce either the correct or incorrect behavior. So that's something to think about. Another thing, of course, is, and this is using game techniques, but small group exercises. If you think of World of Warcraft, like there's 10 million people in World of Warcraft, you can never interact with all those people. So you have small groups to accomplish your goals or to work in your goals. And small group exercises work really well for those challenges. Sometimes the challenge is overwhelming for one student, but if you put them in another group, that can be effective. Now, of course, you always have group work issues that you need to think through and that you need to deal with, and those kind of things. Another is let learners present solutions. So when you create that challenge and the learners come up with solutions, even midway through, a good idea is to have them present that to other learners. So I talked earlier about this challenge that I present to my students. They have to develop a proposal for an e-learning project. But I start them off with a warm-up exercise. So the first thing they have to do is write a business plan with no financials, because I don't teach financials. They have to write a business plan to develop an e-learning company. So they have to research the e-learning field, they have to research what e-learning companies do, what kind of software they do, the structure of the organization, and that's a warm-up exercise. But at the end of that exercise of creating the business plan, they have to present that business plan to their fellow students. And the fellow students actually evaluate, was the information comprehensive? Did it give a good indication of the current state of the e-learning field? Were there gaps in there? Now, I don't use that 100% as my grading, but what I use it as is a chance for the learners to present solutions, how this company, to each other, and give feedback to each other by allowing the learners through that process. And they can score points for the learners and all that kind of stuff, and keep track of that. Then when I actually give them the RFP and they actually have to present in front of people from corporate America, they've already done it. They presented once to their peers. They've gotten feedback on how they presented. They've gotten help on how they presented real time right after they present. And they get that from the corporate people as well. But it allows them to practice that process. And that's another thing that games do really well. They allow us to do the same thing over again until we get it right. So think of that in a classroom setting. We have a test. You take the test once, you get the grade, you're done. But a game allows you to have an experience, and if you didn't do so well, you can have that experience again, slightly differently, and you can do it until you defeat the level or defeat the bad guy or do it again. That's called mastery learning. And we encourage mastery learning, and we allow students to master the content. And in a game, that's what it is. It's mastery learning. You master the level, and then you move on to the next level. So that's really a good way to think about instruction as well. The other thing that's really kind of interesting in games from the social aspect of it is to actually provide times for unstructured chats. What that does is allow people to talk about the concept and the content and the ideas, but not formally. So oftentimes in classroom settings, we run right up to the time when class is over, and then, oh, we didn't have time to cover everything, we'll see you later. But actually we know from research that reflective learning is really effective for learning new information. So it might be a good idea at the end of some classes to allow 10 minutes for the learners to talk to each other about the subject. You could seed it with some questions, or you could, if you wanted to, you could just let them, kind of speak freely and answer the questions. And I've had students say, out of all the class content we covered, these sessions, informal chats, were the most helpful because I got questions answered in a very informal way. I got an understanding of where I was versus the other learners. I got new information from them, and all in a chat that's not structured, not quote formal instruction, but allowing people to kind of test their own knowledge and see where they are. So that's a good technique to keep in mind as well. And I hope everybody has been kind of following the chat. Some people, Damon's just put in some game Logic Pro. Some other people talked about Poll Anywhere and Prometheus. Some other people were talking about other kinds of games, Munitac. So there's a lot of really good games and tools out there. And by checking out this chat, you can see a lot of those types of things. So I have some more information to tell you, but in the meantime, let me stop and see if there's any questions that you have so far about anything that I've discussed, or in this section, or even in the previous section.
There is one question that's come up from several other participants. And as you could guess, Carl, not everyone has yet had an opportunity to bring these sort of things into the classroom. So there seems like so much stuff here. If you had to really focus it down for somebody, where do they start? I mean, do they go, whatever their field is, maybe it's manufacturing or social sciences or whatever. Where do you start? How can you get this so that you don't get overwhelmed by either the development aspects of it or anything? I mean, is there, on your list of resources, is there a clear starting point so I can sort of get my feet wet in this?
That's a great question. So I don't know if I have on my list of resources, but I would say, let's say that I didn't have access. So I'm going to give you 2, maybe 3 routes.
Okay.
If I didn't have any access to a game in my field, I would try to create a challenge for my students. And maybe I would just make it a week long or 2 weeks to get started before I got kind of all the kinks worked out. But I would say, okay, in this chapter, instead of how I typically lecture, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in the form of a problem, and as students solve the problem, I'm going to give them information that I would have lectured to them about, or that they would have learned about, or they would have encountered anyway, and give them some resources. So I think a challenge, that's kind of the challenge in the story, working those 2 items together.
Yes. If
I didn't have any technology or research. If I went online and I found like Immunitac or the West Point Bridge or Atlantis has sustainability things, I would take one of my chapters or one of my sections of my class that matched that content, and then I would just replace that week or 2 weeks with that gameplay. Now, remember what I said earlier, in that you can't just give them a game and say, good luck, go learn, and come back later. So you need to guide them through the learning process. Periodically through the game, do a debrief. Okay, what did you learn from this experience? What do you think the game's trying to teach you? What type of lessons can you draw? So you kind of have to encourage them to think about the learning aspects of the game. They may not do that as readily if you don't do that. The third aspect, and this is really kind of interesting as well, which we didn't talk about, was to take a chapter or a unit and have students make a game out of that content. And so what that means is students really have to do a paper-based game. It doesn't have to be electronic. You could just literally take a newsprint, without the newspaper without the printing on it, and you could literally draw that as your game board and have the students develop a game to teach the content. Now, some of the games will be fantastic. You could use those next semester. Some of the games will be okay. But the process of thinking about rules, thinking about putting those things into place will help your students get that knowledge. So those are 3 different entry points into the process. And if you look through, again, the other thing is some people say, well, the games aren't, I can't find a game appropriate to my community college students.
Yeah.
All the games are too young. What I do with that in some cases is I say, okay, find a game that's too young. How would you, 1, make the game more appealing to older kids? And 2, what are the problems or the things this game does particularly effective? So I actually have them dissect the game. And by doing that, I have them dissect the content. And so they're learning about the content, playing the game, but not playing the, quote, childish game. They're playing it because they're an evaluator of the game. They want to see if the content makes sense. They want to see how to improve it. So it gets them to play the game, but also gets them to think about the content at larger levels.
Very interesting. I like the students creating their own game sort of approach. Once you give them a little bit of a seeding, so you just don't start with that. But
right.
I really think that could be an effective approach.
Yeah, we do it here actually, again, on paper, and we've had some students, probably even some students. We had one year these students. He worked at a metal shop, and he created kind of like Monopoly pieces, but out of game characters. Like he made a little Mario out of metal and a little Space Invader alien and Sonic the Hedgehog. I mean, he did a great job. They make little cards, color cards and stuff. So it's really, the students get very creative. And if it's on subject, they also learn the subject because they play the game over and over again in the process of creating it. And then what we do is we switch games. So once this group of students have created this game, they switch it with the other group, and the other group kind of plays their game to see, oh, we didn't think of this, or oh, hey, you didn't teach this subject, or hey, you forgot about this concept. And it really gets them talking about the subject matter in a very open and free way. Interesting.
Why don't you take us a little bit further, and then we'll have a final round of questions coming up.
Okay, sure. So I kind of want to wrap up in terms of some of the concepts we talked about, because as Mike, as you indicated, we talked about a lot of concepts today, and there's a lot of things to think about. But I think the important thing is to think about games as engagement. So how do we get to this point? Well, kids are playing and engaged in games very frequently. They understand games and they understand game conventions. So to bring that into a classroom is effective because it's an engagement. And what we want is we want our learners to be engaged, and we can engage them in multiple ways through this thing called number 2, which is gamification. So gamification is basically the concept of using game-based thinking and mechanics to help with learning and problem solving and motivating learners. So using thinking like a game developer, and really the thing I would say to everybody, and you may or may not like this homework, I might think I'm crazy, but go play games. If you really want to understand some of those techniques, and I saw some instructional designers, game developers know how to engage their learners, how to keep their learners, and how to or players, and how to keep those players involved. We need to borrow some of that as instructional professionals. I think we do parts of that, I think we can do it at a higher level. And I'm not saying that we have to entertain our students all the time. What I'm saying is we need to engage them all the time. And if we can engage them with authentic type of activities, like in Second Life in the clinic that somebody mentioned, or Immune Attack where you're going through the body, or where you're building a bridge to make sure it crosses the chasm, or if you're doing medical stuff like edheads.org where they're showing you how to do knee replacement surgery. All those things are authentic problems that need to be solved on a regular basis. We're constantly building or fixing bridges. We're constantly replacing body parts. We're constantly thinking about health. So all of those things can be really effective, and that's through gamification. So number 3, are games and instruction educational? Yes, they are if they're designed in a manner that evokes activity and engagement. If you simply say, okay, I'm just going to give everybody 5 points for doing X, Y, or Z, that's not really going to work. Really, the elements that work best for games are challenges, stories, and engagement, and allowing the learner to think through that. And if you can do that, you can get the learner very excited and very involved. And what we can also do is we can build links to our alumni by asking them for authentic stories and problems that we can introduce into the classroom. Frequently have students come back and they present the problem, they explain the problem, they challenge the students to the problem. And it's kind of like, I often, whenever an alumni comes back, it reminds me a lot of me talking to my kids, right? I'll tell my son, hey Nate, did you know that in order to effectively, did you know that income inequity, for example, can undermine a democracy? And he'd be like, yeah, Dad. But then his like friend or teacher will say the same thing to him, and then he'll come home and goes, hey Dad, did you know that income inequity will undermine a democracy? I'm like, Nate, and my students are the same way. I'll tell them something in class, they'll be like, yeah, thanks Dr. Kopp. And then I'll have an external speaker come in and they'll say something, and they'll say, oh Dr. Kopp, did you hear what they just said? I'm like, yeah. So it's just a different perspective. So I think having that can be really, really good from a learning perspective. So having alumni involved, and they like to be involved. And then finally, games can impact learning in a lot of different ways. They can engage the learner in that activity. They can engage higher level thinking. They can engage, I hate to call it lower level thinking because we have to memorize things. We can't get in any field without memorization of knowledge. It's absolutely required. Games are great for memorizing knowledge. How do you memorize? Well, it's through repetitiveness. It's through chunking of the information, and games do that really well. Like the Jeopardy example, great for declarative knowledge that you have to learn. So those are ways in which, as I summarize today's presentation, we really want to think about using games for our instruction and really having them impact our learners so that our learners can be more engaged and more active. And as an instructor, I can tell you it'll be more exciting for you as you work in these elements. Now, I'm not going to lie, it might be a little bit more work up front as well, trying to figure this out and trying to make it work. But I would say, hey, involve your students. Tell them, hey, I want to make this unit into a fun kind of activity, game type thing. Let's work together to do this. They'll be learning the content, they'll be learning the way to teach it, and they'll be really engaged in the process. So my assignment to everybody today is to tell three people 3 different things that you learned from this presentation. So when you're done, I want you to go out into the world, and it's Friday night, so you're out with friends to dinner or something. Tell them 3 different things you learned from the presentation. Or you pick up your kids from the way from home, tell them 3 different things that you learned from this presentation. So that's your challenge from this presentation, is to do this activity.
So does that mean there's 9 here? Is it a 3 by 3, or can I use the 3 same people? I got to judge this. Oh, you know which one I'm going to do? I'll tell you which one it is in a minute, but maybe we'll go ahead to the next one.
Okay, I think you're gaming the system there, Mike.
Oh, would participants please enter final questions as we get some additional information here? Please put your questions in. Carl, there's some interesting stuff here coming up, or references that you've gotten here on this slide, right?
Yes. So, and I'm going to put this on my blog. So that's my blog address. But if you just Google Cop Notes, it's an easier way to find it.
Yeah.
The Gamification of Learning and Instruction is the book that's coming out in the spring. I'm in final edits right now. I wrote an article for Training and Development magazine called Matching the Right Instruction to the Right Content, which helps match instructional strategies with different kind of content that you're teaching. And available online for free is the article I did called Improving Training, Thinking Like a Game Developer, talking about a lot of the concepts that we talked about here that people can incorporate into their instructional design.
Is there a conference on gaming?
Yeah, there's a bunch of conferences. One of the ones that I really like is down in Atlanta. I don't know if anybody is here from Atlanta, called the Siege Conference. It's the Southern Entertainment, I'm trying to look that up, Entertainment.
Yeah, but is it video gaming or educational gaming conference?
That one is video gaming, and
yeah.
I would encourage people to at least go to one video gaming one. It's a totally different world.
Sounds scary.
It is scary. And
yeah.
the funny thing to me was, like I get all these training conferences,
yeah.
and so everybody's very formal and these conferences, man, they're swearing like truck drivers. It's unbelievable. I'm like, you can't stand up and say that, but there they are.
Yeah.
So if you're offended by that, don't
yeah.
do that. But here's the link to the Siege conference, which is pretty cool.
There, yeah.
Clark Aldridge does a conference more for learning, a game conference. And let me find that one as well. That's a good one too. He does that out west, so if anybody's out towards Seattle, that's a good conference. And some conferences like Tech Knowledge,
I know that one, yeah.
Conference by ASTD. They all have a track on gaming or serious gaming,
yeah.
And that's a good one to look up as well. If you're looking for any kind of information, look up serious gaming or serious games.
All right. Now,
that'll give you a lot of information.
Good. We've got a couple of questions, but let me take us forward one slide here.
Okay.
This stuff here is some of the things that you just talked about, right?
Right.
Oh, there's stuff. This is in the handout that we're sending out, right? All of this stuff.
I believe it is. Yes.
Learning in 3D. Looks pretty interesting.
Yeah, that book's primarily focused on using virtual worlds. Somebody mentioned Second Life. And
yes.
So that I co-wrote that with Tony O'Driscoll and really talked about how can you use virtual worlds for instruction. How do you create the instruction? How do you model the instruction? And those types of things.
Cool. And on the bottom here, you're a very brave person, Carl, to put your email out there. We're gonna distribute this email. We're gonna raffle it off on eBay afterwards. No, I'm just kidding. But it's very kind of you to offer it to our participants because I know you're very responsive about emails, and if someone has a follow-up question, I'm sure you'd be willing to take it.
Oh yeah, I'd be more than happy to. I get questions all the time. Sometimes I'll link people to my blog in terms of what's happening there to answer the question, or sometimes I'll answer the question. So right now on my blog, for example, somebody asked me about game development software. So I did 3 different entries about different tools that you can use. Like there's a really cool tool if you're doing a simulation called SimWriter. And SimWriter allows you to create a branching simulation. If you want to add a character, there's to your instruction, there's one called Code Baby. So it's kind of a funny name, but actually it gives you a cartoon type character that you can actually speak your script, if you will.
Oh yeah.
And it matches the lips, so it looks like the character is saying what you're speaking.
I gotta look.
Which is really kind of interesting. Yeah, it's kind of interesting.
Let me
I saw a question. Do you have time for me to answer it real quick?
Let me pay the bills for a second,
okay.
And then we'll come back to that. I'm going to now ask you whether you're live right now or you might be listening to this recorded version. I'm going to post a very brief survey here, if I can know what I'm doing. And while we're talking, Carl, this survey is going to appear on the screen, and we're going to ask participants if they would just go ahead and take the survey. Carl, don't close it yourself. And there's just a couple of quick questions here. And what this allows us to do is demonstrate impact and usefulness of the webinar work we do to our sponsors at the National Science Foundation. So thank you. Now, Carl, while this is up there, go ahead and talk about the response you're going to give. We'll leave the survey up while you go. Yeah.
So somebody had asked about using Second Life for a psychology class, I believe. Yeah, an online psychology course, advice for using Second Life. Yeah. I think, well, a couple of interesting things that you could do that. There is actually a place in Second Life where you can go, and of course I don't remember it off the top of my head right now, but it allows you to experience what a schizophrenic experience is. So there are voices, there are things that aren't quite in focus, and it's really kind of scary. So that is an interesting place to go within Second Life itself. The other thing that you could do in a psychology class is you could role play, some interactions and see how those work. There's a colleague of mine, Sarah Robbins, did a really interesting study one time. She wanted her students to feel what it was like to be discriminated against, and she had a pretty homogeneous group. So she actually had her students, one by one, dress up as the Kool-Aid Man in Second Life and go and hang out in a nightclub. So in the nightclub, all the characters in the nightclub, all the avatars in the nightclub are, dressed to the teeth, and they're all buff and they look fantastic. And then this big roly-poly Kool-Aid Man walks in. Yeah. And at first, of course, they're kind of funny that the Kool-Aid Man's there, haha. And then the Kool-Aid Man starts dancing and bumping into people, and people start being rude and impolite, and then finally asking the Kool-Aid Man to get out. And the student who's playing the Kool-Aid Man gets to experience that whole process in safety. There's no physical damage, or there's no whatever. And then they come back and they write about what it's like to be discriminated against. And she said the essays are far richer because these students have had an authentic experience in a completely safe environment.
I like it. Just
so
a good
yeah,
example.
That's a way. That's a way to think about giving students experiences in a virtual world that maybe they couldn't in another world. There's another. The Holocaust Museum in New York has a very moving exhibit in Second Life. So that's another place to go there and check that out. So there's lots of places in Second Life that provide interesting experiences that could then be talked about from a psychological perspective.
You know what, Carl, thank you. Let me wrap this up here, and we'll have a final closing comment at the end. Everyone, I'm going to close the survey now. I hope you've had enough time to fill it out, and thank you very much for doing that. So here we're closing in 3, 2, 1. Thank you. So to wrap up from today, to access the recording, slides, and handout, I'd like to invite you to visit matechnetworks.org. And if you just use the keyword search webinar instructional gaming, you can access, again, the recording, the slides, and the handout at that link. Next semester, that sounds funny, doesn't it? February 10th, we're going to feature a webinar on entrepreneurial development at community colleges. February 17th continues our Master Series production with What Color is Your Parachute, essentially focusing on creative career planning. And then on March 9th, what's innovative in manufacturing today? We'll be dealing with that. You can find out these offerings and more at matechnetworks.org/growth, and that's sort of our professional growth area of the website. If you would like a certificate of participation of attending this live version, you can just write to Lynette. You see her address there, lynette.gahiola@domail.maricopa.edu, and we'll send that to you. First, we'll check the roster to make sure that you were here. And finally, thank you for attending this webinar, Instructional Gaming. Carl, it was really fascinating today. You know, it's one of the three things I'm going to tell tonight. And it just struck me, it was one of those things where you sort of hit yourself on top of the head. As a person moves up from a level, through a level of a game, that's their evidence of problem solving. And I'm thinking, oh my God, there it is right in front of me. I never somehow struck that, that fact until you said it today. So that really got me.
Oh, good. Well, thanks, Mike.
How about something that struck you from the chat windows or the discussions today as a wrap-up point?
Well, what I liked from the group is the one thing that impressed me was all of the resources that were inherent in the group themselves.
Yes.
They were kind of throwing out all these kind of fantastic resources. So I think that's great. And the openness to try it and to give this a shot. I saw several people say they're going to try certain things in their classroom, and I think that's fantastic, and I hope it works, and let me know how it goes.
Carl, thanks again. It was really our pleasure to have you here, and we're just putting up a couple of people that asked for that email again for the certificate, so you can see it going up there on the screen. Carl, again, thanks. I'm looking forward to the book coming out in the spring, and I bet it'll be a sense of accomplishment to get that out there too, huh?
Yes, I'll be glad to have that done.
Good. All right, thank you again, Carl. And to participants today, that formally ends the webinar. We're perfectly on time. Thank you for joining us. Please, as some of you have done, go ahead and raise your hands in applause to Carl, and thank you all. That concludes our webinar.